In this video, I'm going to talk about an underutilized use for asset store assets. I call it the Asset Store Chop Shop. I'm the Undead Dev, and welcome to my channel. So, let's say you're a game dev that regularly buys assets from the asset store or collects those monthly free drops from Fab, formerly the Unreal Marketplace. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that you've got a bunch of assets that you've collected over time. But let's also say that a lot of these assets are distinct characters or distinct props that people will recognize from their uses in other games where people have just used those same assets without changing them at all. And you don't want to look like just another game that churns asset store assets into games to put on a marketplace. Well, have no fear, there's still another use for these meshes. In most cases where somebody's trying to make asset store assets their own, they'll go ahead and pull them into a third-party software and make some changes to the mesh, add something to it, or change the textures and materials. There's a lot of videos on that already. This isn't going to be one of those. What I want to talk about is going in the other direction. I want to take the meshes and break them down into what I think are interesting reusable shapes, and then save those shapes in my asset library for use in future projects. And once you have a library of interesting shapes that you can pull from at any time, you never have to worry about starting from a blank canvas. You can start kit bashing characters out of arms and legs that you've saved from previous characters. You can use those meshes to collage them together into something more interesting. You can quickly create unique base meshes composed of other parts that you've already liked. This will speed up your modeling process in the future. And sometimes having unique or interesting shapes to start with in the future can unblock whatever creative slump you might be in. For this video, I'm going to be doing this all in Unreal and Blender, but the concepts I'm talking about are pretty universal. Full disclosure, things I'm not going to be worrying about when I do this are the rigging. Regardless of how I use these, I'm probably going to need to re-rig the mesh anyway, so we can just throw away any existing skeletons. I'm also not going to worry about textures and materials. We're going to be stripping these down to interesting shapes, which means we're going to be blowing out any UVs or texturing that might have been done. I'm not really worried about that at this point. I think that the texturing needs to be one of the last steps to make the entire mesh kind of cohesive. And so I'm fine getting rid of any existing texturing that come in on my models. So what I am trying to save from my library, I want to save interesting shapes, so meshes, things that might be reusable from project to project. And I'm also trying to save interesting surface details, so VDMs. If you're not familiar with VDMs in Blender, these are brushes that you can use between projects. They're similar to alpha brushes, except you can have overhangs and more complicated geometry that wouldn't be possible with a simple alpha brush. I'll be showing you how I break down models into meshes and shapes that I really like and save those in my Blender asset library, and how I create VDM brushes from interesting details on the meshes themselves and reuse those in other projects. Let's go. So to start, let's take a look at the Epic Store on Fab. So these are the assets put out by Epic Games on the Fab store. I'm specifically going to be looking at characters and creatures. Now, Epic is nice enough to make all of their assets free for use for anybody who wants to. And so these are some really cool assets that they made, mostly for the game Paragon that never actually came out. But the assets are great. The problem is they're very distinct. Like if you look at these assets, every one of them is AAA quality and really interesting. But once you see it one place, you're going to recognize it anywhere else you see it. But if you see some of the shapes from these characters on different assets, you might not recognize them as having come from a specific character. So what I generally do is I go through my assets and I look for interesting shapes that maybe I can pull off. So let's take a look at some of these. So this is Rampage. It's an interesting character. You can see right here that there's a couple of different base meshes that is used on this guy. I can look right away and see that the head on this statue version of him is really interesting and could be easily taken off that mesh and used as a static mesh for some sort of gargoyle or some interesting wall decorations. I think there's some stuff that could be done right there. I'm noticing a lot of these interesting rock patterns on the rock version of him, and I could probably get some pretty good VDM brushes out of that. So these are the kind of things you need to be looking for. The feet being webbed would be great if you need some sort of aquatic character. You could pull those webbed feet. This is another character. Right away, I see that hat. I could see that hat being warped and redecorated and made interesting. So there's an easy hat mesh that I could have off this character. Here's the Minions project from Paragon, which is all of the enemies that you would see in the game. I think this would be a great one to pull from. There's some really interesting base meshes here, especially with this guy, that face with the lower jaw, just that shape of the lower jaw would be great to pull. I think there's a lot of interesting things that could be pulled from this. And then I really like this model too, this Iggy and Scorch. There's some great geometry on this model that I think could be really interesting to play with. And there's a couple of different variations. It'd be nice to maybe pull these antlers off and have antlers I can easily add to any model. There's some really interesting things happening with the hard surface version. But I also think that there's some really cool stuff going on with the organic model, and then some really cool VDMs we could probably pull from that. So I'm going to go ahead and take this Paragon Iggy and Scorch model and open that up in Unreal Engine so we can get a better look at it. So here we are. We've loaded up the character select screen for the Iggy and Scorch model. So I can walk around and take a look at each one of these models and the different variations in the skins. Most of them use the exact same model with different textures. I think they've added horns to this one, but other than that, it's the same model that you see in these others. This metal one, though, is its own unique model, and it's really interesting. I think there's some really cool stuff I could pull off this guy. And then there's this bird version, which is really cool looking in-game, but because it is textured with these feathers, and those feathers aren't going to make the translation into Blender as easily, I don't think there's a lot I can do with this model. But I do think just the standard Iggy and Scorch model is really cool. Looking at it right away, I can steal this hand. That hand would be great to put in an asset library and reuse. It's a very simple looking base mesh, but it looks like it could be used for a variety of different purposes. I also really like this tail with the little globes on it. I think that's a cool detail they added here. And I'm very interested in maybe making one of these globes a VDM brush so I could just brush these the globes and the skin around it onto other surfaces. I think there's some really cool stuff going on here. I also kind of like how this foot acts. I might think about adding this foot to my library. And these teeth on the outside of the jaw here, I think are cool shapes that would make a great brush. So just looking at these models, that's the kind of things I'm thinking about. What are the cool shapes that could be used in other places? And a lot of this hard surface stuff would also be great to add to an asset library. Just simple shapes that kind of look like they fit together that you could then bash into other shapes in the future. So those are the kind of things I'm looking at when I look at these models. So let me go ahead and export this model and open it up in Blender. So I select this model just by clicking it in the page. I can press this to browse to it, and then I can just right click on it and I can export this FBX. I have a folder here called Chop Shop Example. I'm going to save it there. I'm not going to change anything from the defaults, and we'll export. And then I'm going to jump over to Blender. So here I am in Blender. I'm going to get rid of the default cube, and I'm going to pull in that Iggy and Scorch FBX. Now I could try and load it by going to File and Import and then searching for it, or I could just open up my the File Explorer and click and drag, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to change anything on the defaults. I'm just going to import, and here we go. Now, The skeleton is clearly wrong, but that's okay because we don't need the skeleton. Let's take a look at the actual model. You can see that there's a root and then the skeleton and then a bunch of different LODs. We want LOD 0, which is going to be the most detailed of the LODs. So we'll select that LOD and press Alt P. And what Alt P does is it clears the parent. So right now this is attached to all those other pieces, but we're only really interested in this mesh. So clear the parent, and suddenly everything gets dark because the parent had it scaled down. But now that it's no longer under the parent, it is huge, but that's okay. Right click on that main Iggy and Scorch, select the hierarchy, hit X to delete those all because we don't need anything else. We have this main model that we're looking at. So here we go. He's huge, and that's because there's actually a change in size between Unreal and Blender. You can change that by manipulating the scale in Blender to match the scale in Unreal. But for right now, I'm just going to go ahead and manually change the scale of this mesh. It should be 0.01 because it is 0.01 units in Unreal compared to Blender. And here he is. He's tiny, but you can see with where the light is and the camera that this is much more to scale for the scene than the original mesh was. So now just click on the mesh, go to Object, and Apply Scale. And now we're back to ones. And this should work just fine. So now the next thing we want to think about doing is if we click on him and we go into Edit mode, we can see that there's a lot of triangles here. In fact, everything's triangles, and that's because in Unreal Engine, everything is triangles. It doesn't understand quads, but that's not great for topology, especially if we're going to be working on this mesh and trying to keep pieces. So the easy way to change that is to click A, hit Alt J, and it tries to do triangles to quads. This doesn't always work great, but it works well enough. You can see here that the hand and the arm have gone back into using a much cleaner topology. Let me change the color on this to random. And you can see a little bit better now that the topology has gotten a lot cleaner, especially on the hard surface pieces, where it can easily go into quads where it was previously triangles before. So that's good. I went ahead and changed the coloring to random. That will be useful for a couple of reasons here. One of which will be that as we're pulling pieces off of this, we're going to be breaking them into other meshes. And so this will help us differentiate between the different meshes that we're creating here. So now if we look, this mesh is pretty high poly, but it's not high enough for something that we'd want to reuse in other projects. Normally, before exporting it, it would have baked the normals off of an even more detailed mesh. And we could probably go ahead and take the normal map that this asset uses and reverse engineer it to add a lot of those surface details back onto this mesh. But that's going to be really difficult, especially with this being a Paragon asset and the textures being pretty difficult to export. There's videos on that specifically. But for right now, I think we're good enough just using the details that are here. I think there's a lot of interesting pieces even without those normal details. But I am going to go ahead and subdivide this mesh once just so that we have it a little bit smoother and have a little more geometry to work with. So I'm going to go back into object mode and I'm going to hit Control 2. And you see now that it's added a subdivision surface modifier. And everything looks a lot smoother. So this is going to give us a little bit more geometry to work with as we start pulling this stuff apart. Right now, though, this is just a modifier. So let's go ahead and apply that so we get the actual geometry out of it. This mesh has shape keys, so we need to get rid of those first. We can go to Data. And here you can see the shape keys. Just click on those. Click the minus sign, and they'll be gone. Now apply, hit tab, and there we go. We've got all the geometry. Sometimes quite a lot of geometry. But this will be pretty usable. So the first thing I'd like to start pulling apart is the arm here. I think this is an interesting shape. I think it could be repurposed for a lot of different uses. And so I'm going to go ahead and start working with that. So I'm going to go into face mode by pressing 3. I'm going to click on a face on the arm here that leads into this, because what I want to do is separate this part from this part. And I can press Control L to get all faces that are attached to that face. And you see this whole arm lights up. Then I'm going to press H to hide that arm. And now everything over here is just free floating. And I can just go ahead and get rid of everything that's not this to kind of make this easier to select. Because there's a few different pieces in here. I can't just easily select them. So I'm going to hit Control Z to go into kind of see-through mode so I can select the back faces. And I'm just going to make a big box, get as close to the arm without touching it, then Control L to select anything that's attached to the stuff that I've already selected. Just press H again to hide that. And then just select these remaining floating pieces and press H again. Now what I'm left with is just this arm floating in space, which is the part that I want to keep. So now I can press Alt Z to go back. Actually, I'm going to leave it in the see-through mode. Then just do a box select right here. And now to just remove it from the original mesh, I could duplicate it first if I was worried about saving something, but I'm not. I'm going to just pull this apart. So now that I have all of the geometry I'm interested in selected, I'm going to press P. I'm just going to separate the selection. And now I can go back into standard viewing mode. I can press Alt H to unhide everything that's hidden. And you can see now that we have two meshes. It picked a random color, but it picked a random color very similar to the color it originally was. And we can rename this mesh to arm. So now in the future, if I ever need a mechanical arm, I can use this. So now we've separated the arm from the mesh, but let's make this so it's a little bit easier to use in the future. I'm going to hide the original mesh again. I'm going to edit this arm by hitting Tab. And it looks like there's a really cool spot right here in the middle of the arm where all of the polygons merge. I'm going to go into vertex mode and click that spot. I'm going to hit Shift S to say cursor to selected, which will move the 3D cursor to that point. And you can see it's done that. And now if I go back out in object mode, I can press Object, Set Origin, Origin to 3D cursor. So now we've set the origin of this object directly to that point. So now if we click this and we go back over here, we can see that the location is not 0. We can press delete on that to make it 0. And now you can see that this arm is at the world center location. So now if we go into orthographic modes and we rotate it, so you can get it just about center. And that's probably good enough for my needs. And there we go. We've got an arm right at the center. And I can go ahead and click on this. And I'm going to right click on it. And I'm going to say mark as asset. So what this does is now when I'm in my Blender, I can open up this Blender asset panel. And I can change it to Asset Browser. And right now I've got this unassigned section. And here is the mechanical arm I just created. So I'll be able to open this up in any future version and pull out those pieces that I'm interested in. So I can make some changes. First thing to note is that if you try and make changes while you're in all libraries mode, it will let you, because it will only let you make changes to the library you're in, even if the item you're trying to change is in the library you're in. So let's switch this to current file. And now if we click on mechanical arm, we can open up this side panel and we can do things like add a description. We can generate the preview. So this is generated here, but if we needed to update this, we can do capture screenshot preview, which will actually capture this screen right here. So if I wanted to move this to a part where it's a little bit more interesting, and I can click capture screenshot preview and then do this, and bam. Now that is the preview we have when we're looking at this asset. And now now if I click back to all libraries, I can also take this and I can move it underneath some of the existing categories that I've already created for my other library pieces. So I've dragged it under meshes, and now if I go under meshes, I've got mechanical arm there. So this is a great way to start creating a asset library that you can reuse in Blender. So now we've got an arm. Let's take a look at maybe creating a VDM brush, which is a little bit more complicated. So in order to create the VDM brush, we're going to use the VDM Brush Baker plugin, which makes this a lot easier than it is otherwise. You can just get the add-on. It'll allow you to install it in Blender. And then when you open up Blender, under Tool, you'll now have this VDM Brush Baker option. So there's plenty of areas that I could probably take to create a brush from. But I'm going to pick one of these little pustules on the back. I think they're really interesting, and I think they'd make a really cool brush. I'm going to pick this one right here. I think there's a lot of interesting geometry around it, and I think it'd make a really cool brush. So I'm going to go back into edit mode. So here's what I'm going to do. I am going to use the select circle. I'm going to select a face here. Control L to select all adjacent faces. I'm going to turn the radius up on my circle a little bit. I'm going to hold shift and just paint around the shape I want to keep. And unlike before, where I really cared about making sure that the mesh line was really clean, I don't need to worry about that as much here because I'm going to be baking this into a brush, and anything that goes far enough below the line won't be used anyways. So here we go. There's a decent amount of geometry there that I'm interested in. I'm going to duplicate this geometry because I don't want to ruin the initial mesh in case there's other pieces I'd like to take from it. So I'm going to press Shift D. As you can see here, I have that new mesh that's duplicated, and I'm going to right click so it snaps back to where it was. And then I'm going to press P and separate by selection. And now I have this new mesh right here. So I'm going to hide that original mesh I was working on, hit tab to go into object mode, hit tab again to go back into edit mode, and now we've got this mesh. So now we need to bake this piece into a VDM brush. So let's go to the VDM Brush Baker plugin. And we're going to create a sculpting plane. This just adds a grid to the floor here. Now we can click on this item. And in order to move it to the floor, there's a couple of different ways we could do it. In edit mode, I'm going to select everything and then press Shift S and then cursor to selected, which will put the cursor in the middle of the selected geometry. Then if I go back into object mode, I can set the origin to that 3D cursor. And now if I move the location back to 0, it's now in the middle of the sculpting plane that we created for the VDM brush. So there's a couple of things I want to change here. It's a little small. I'd like to scale it up, and I'd like to rotate it. So I'm going to scale. And I'm going to rotate it so that it's kind of even with the sculpting plane. You want it to get as flat as you can get it. I'm going to move it up a little bit. I'm going to turn off snapping so that it's protruding from the sculpting plane a little bit. I want as much of it above the sculpting plane as possible. And I'm going to scale it up a little bit more now that we've done all that. Maybe move it a little bit more centered. This looks like it'll be an interesting, it'll have some interesting geometry. Let me rotate a little bit more. Cool, so that looks good to me. So now I need to do a couple of things. I need to edit this geometry so all of it falls below the sculpting plane. So if I go here and I hit tab, I can now switch over to selecting the edges here. I just want all of the outside edges. This one, it doesn't matter that I didn't get the outside edge as it's below the surface plane anyways. And now that I've selected all the outside edges, I just want to go ahead and from the side, pull them all down until I see that they're all below the sculpting plane. I don't want any of the edges to be above the sculpting plane, and it looks good to me now. So now if I hit tab and then I go back to the sculpting plane, I'm going to get rid of this multi-res VDM. I'm not really going to use that here. I'm going to go to solidify here. I'm going to solidify it so that it goes down below the bottom of what we just created there. And there we go. Now we've got it covering the base of this mesh. We're going to go ahead and apply that so that it creates the geometry. And then we're going to click the mesh and then the sculpting plane and hit Control J. And that will join those two meshes into one. So now let's take a look at sculpting. Here is the sculpting plane with the mesh that we wanted to pull the geometry from. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remesh this so it's all one mesh. I'm going to press R to set the size of the mesh. And then Control R to remesh. And you can see that the model has been remeshed now. So hold Shift on the edges here, smooth everything out. You don't want strong changes between the two. You want to kind of hide that seam a little bit. Switch to random. You can see the color a little better here. You can see where that seam is. And you just want to get rid of that seam the best you can. Here I had some jagged topology, and I can just smooth that out too. That looks pretty good to me. So now let's drop back out of sculpting mode and go back to object mode. Let's hit tab to go into edit mode, Alt Z, and then look at it from the side. And what we want to do is we want to get rid of all of the geometry below that top surface plane. So you're going to select a box, go right up here. Looks like we've got everything. Hit X, delete the faces. And then take a look. It looks like we still have a little bit of geometry here on the sides. So we can loop select that. Switch into face mode. And delete these side faces. And now what we should have is a plane with some geometry on it that we're interested in. So let's take this and go into UV editing. And for this one, we're mostly just up and down, so we can probably just project this. So go to UV. I'll take a look at it from the top. And I will project from view with bounds. And then I'm going to go ahead and do that select circle, change the radius again. I'm going to select those interfaces, the ones where the geometry is changing the most. Just make sure not to select anything on the edge of this, because we want to keep the edges straight. All right, now that we've selected those faces, we can go up to UV and minimize stretch. Then in the iterations, you can move it up to like 3 or 4, hit enter. And it should work to minimize the amount of stretch in these UV islands. So now let's go back to the standard layout. We'll go back to our render and create VDM brush. And I'm going to name this new brush Pustule. I'm going to make it 1024 pixels wide. And then I'm just going to press render and create VDM brush. And the way you'll know it worked is that it says the name is taken because that brush already exists because we just created that brush. So now if we hide this plane, if we create a new mesh to sculpt on, I'm going to go with the round cube. That's one of the extra primitives meshes if you've got the extra primitives plugins turned on. And I'm going to go ahead and subdivide this a couple of times. I'm going to go ahead and apply this so that I've got the geometry. And now if I go into sculpt mode, I've got a new brush down here called Pustule, which is the brush we just created. I can click on it, I can drag, and we've got pustules. You can change the rotation by the orientation of the mouse and the size by how far you drag. And you just add those all over the place. And you can add these to any mesh going forward. So to turn a VDM brush into an asset, they need to go to the brush. And under texture here, it has this pustule texture. You need to mark fake user. Otherwise, when you save this and load it into other brushes, the texture will not go with it. And you won't have the same effect that you're getting here. And that's it. So now if you load this up using any other project, it should come in. So in order for your asset libraries to move between projects, you need to save your asset library files to locations where Blender knows where to look for them. Set your import method to append and set your path. I use Dropbox to save all of my asset libraries so that they work between computers, but make sure your asset library is pointed at a location that you are using. Then make sure that the file that you're using to save your assets is saved to that same location. So I'm going to save this file, this Blender file, to my asset library. And now this will be available from other projects. So now I'm going to take this sphere with the pustule mark on it. I'm going to go to the pustule brush in my asset library, and I'm going to capture the screenshot preview again. And there you go, it'll update. So now whenever you need to use the brush, you can use this icon to see it. And I'm going to drag this brush to VDMs. And now I've got a new VDM brush that I can add to other projects. And now here I am in a brand new project, completely different file than the one I was working on. And if I go to my asset browser, I have the pustule brush I just created, and I have the mechanical arm I just created. And using them is super simple. All you have to do is click and drag. Uh-oh. Well, that arm is smaller and not rotated in the direction I wanted it to be. So this is a good example of showing you how you can update these after you create them. So I can now right-click on it and open the blend file, and this will open up the blend file for that asset that I created. So right here we have the project we were just working on. I can go back to the mechanical arm. And what I forgot to do here, after we created it, was apply all the transforms. And from the scale of the last thing, I think it'd probably be good to also make this a little larger. So I'm going to double its scale and then apply all that and then save. And now it should update automatically in my other project. And delete the one I already pulled out. Grab this, bring it over, and there we go. Now it sets based on the cube here. I can drag out more, and you'll notice if I put it on the side, it faces off the side, which makes it work well. It takes the normal of the geometry that you're adding it to, and you can start creating more and more meshes that are just in your asset library that you can pull out whenever you need them. And that's it. So now you should have the building blocks you need in order to start taking apart those asset store assets and saving the important parts for reuse in later projects. If you found this video helpful, this is your friendly reminder to like and subscribe. And thanks for watching.